For months, I'd been planning the proposal. I was finally ready to take the next step with my girlfriend, Sarah. We'd been together for 3 years, and she made it clear a few times that she was ready to get engaged. I'd saved up for a beautiful ring, arranged a trip to a cabin in the mountains where we'd first gone as a couple, and even written out what I wanted to say when I dropped to one knee. It was supposed to be perfect. The week leading up to the trip, Sarah seemed a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it. She'd been spending more time on her phone, brushing me off when I asked about her plans, and going out late with vague explanations. Just grabbing drinks with my friends, she'd say with a quick kiss on the cheek. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe I was just nervous about the proposal. It's not every day you ask someone to spend the rest of their life with you. 2 days before we were set to leave for the mountains, Sarah told me she was going out again. "It's Stacy's birthday," she said casually as she threw on her coat. "We're just having a low-key night. I'll be home early." Something in her tone didn't sit right with me, but I forced myself to smile. "Okay. Have fun. Love you," she called over her shoulder as she headed out the door. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where she'd just been, that nagging feeling creeping in again. But I pushed it away. This was Sarah. The woman I loved. There was no reason to doubt her. Right. I spent the evening finalizing my plans for the proposal. I booked a dinner reservation at a nice restaurant near the cabin, rehearsed my speech, and even spent some time imagining how her face would light up when I opened the ring box. But as the night wore on, I started to notice how late it was getting. Sarah still wasn't home, and she wasn't responding to my texts. By midnight, I was pacing the living room, my phone buzzing in my hand as I tried calling her for the 5th time. Straight to voicemail. When she finally walked in at nearly 1:30 a.m., she was flushed, her hair a little messier than usual, and she reeked of alcohol. "Hey," she said, kicking off her shoes without looking at me. "Sorry, we lost track of time." "Lost track of time?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I've been calling you all night, Sarah." She waved her hand dismissively. "My phone died." "Relax, Jake. It's not a big deal." But something about the way she avoided my eyes made my stomach twist. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, the doubt I'd been trying to bury started to grow. Something was wrong. And deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The morning after Sarah came home late, I tried to act normal, but something was eating at me. She hummed to herself as she made coffee, completely unbothered by the tension lingering in the air. I watched her from across the kitchen table, the way she moved, the way she smiled. It was so familiar. But now, it felt like I was seeing a stranger. "Hey," I finally said, breaking the silence. "About last night." Sarah looked up from her coffee, raising an eyebrow. "What about it? You were gone for hours. You didn't answer my calls. You get how that might bother me, right?" She sighed, setting her mug down. "Jake, I told you, I was out with Stacy. My phone died. You're overthinking this." "I'm not overthinking," I said, my voice tightening. I feel like you're not telling me everything." Her expression shifted to one of disbelief, almost hurt. "Jake, seriously? You think I'm lying to you?" I hesitated, and in that tiny pause she pounced. "You know me," she said, her voice softer now. "I'm the most trusting person in the world. I don't lie, Jake. I'm not like that. I've never been like that." And here's the thing about Sarah, she always had a way of sounding so sincere, so genuine, that it could disarm anyone. She shook her head and leaned forward, her gaze meeting mine. "I love you. Why would I mess that up? You're the last person I'd ever hurt." Her words hung between us, and for a moment I let my guard drop. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was letting my insecurities get the best of me. Later that day, as I packed our bags for the cabin trip, I replayed her words in my head. "I'm the most trusting person in the world." It was true, Sarah had always been the first to give people the benefit of the doubt. She trusted her friends, her family, even strangers. It was one of the things I'd admired about her when we first got together. But now, it felt like a shield she was using to deflect me. That night, we sat on the couch, watching a movie while I absent-mindedly scrolled through my phone. Sarah had fallen asleep with her head on my shoulder, her breathing soft and steady. I glanced at her, torn between the woman I thought I knew and the lingering doubt gnawing at my mind. As I reached for the remote, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. A single message lit up the screen. "Last night was amazing. When can I see you again?" My chest tightened, the words burning into my mind. I froze, staring at the message, the blood draining from my face. Sarah shifted in her sleep, murmuring softly, but I didn't hear her. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat frozen, staring at Sarah's phone screen. Those words, "Last night was amazing. When can I see you again?" hit me like a gut punch. I didn't even know the number. It was just a string of digits. No name. No contact photo. But I didn't need any more evidence. My mind had already started filling in the blanks. For a second, I considered waking her up right then and there, shoving the phone in her face, and demanding an explanation. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock, or maybe I was afraid of hearing her answer. Instead, I put the phone back on the table as quietly as I could and sat there, staring at the credits rolling on the TV. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Sarah was already in the kitchen, humming a tune as she poured herself a cup. "Good morning," she said, flashing me one of her bright, effortless smiles. I studied her carefully, her cheerful demeanor, the way she seemed so normal. My mind flashed back to the message from last night, and the knot in my stomach tightened. "Morning," I said, my voice a little stiff. She didn't notice. "Are you excited for the trip?" "Yeah," I muttered. "Excited." She walked over and wrapped her arms around me, kissing my cheek. "You've been so quiet lately. Everything okay?" For a split second, I wanted to just blurt it out. "Who sent you that message?" But I stopped myself. If I was going to confront her, I needed more. I couldn't give her any room to gaslight me, to dismiss me the way she had before. As we loaded up the car later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in some kind of alternate reality. Sarah was her usual bubbly self, snapping photos of us packing and joking about how much stuff we were bringing. But behind her laughter, my mind replayed that message on her phone over and over. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, and Sarah spent most of it scrolling through her phone while I drove in silence. At one point, she laughed quietly at something. I glanced over. "What's funny?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, nothing," she said quickly, locking her phone and tossing it into her bag. "Just Stacy being her usual self." Something about the way she said it, too quick, too rehearsed, made my skin crawl. That night at the cabin, everything came to a head. We sat by the fire after dinner, wine glasses in hand. Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder, looking up at me with a soft smile. "This is perfect," she whispered. "You and me, away from everything." I stared into the fire, my thoughts racing. She looked so at peace, so content, but all I could think about was that damn message. "Sarah," I said, my voice low. "Hmm?" she murmured, not lifting her head. "Who was texting you last night?" Her head snapped up, her eyes widening slightly before she quickly recovered. "What? You got a message while we were watching the movie. It said last night was amazing. Who was it from?" For a split second, I saw it, the panic in her eyes. But just as quickly she shook her head, letting out a nervous laugh. "Jake, are you serious right now?" "I saw it, Sarah," I said, my voice firm. "Don't lie to me." Her face hardened. "It was probably a wrong number. Why are you snooping through my messages anyway?" "I wasn't snooping," I snapped. "It popped up on the screen. What was I supposed to do, pretend I didn't see it?" She set her glass down a little too hard, her voice rising. "I can't believe this. You're accusing me of cheating because of some random text? You know me, Jake. I'm not that kind of person. That's not an answer, I said, refusing to let her deflect. Tell me who it was from. Her mouth opened like she was about to say something, but then she closed it again, her jaw tight. You're being ridiculous, she muttered, standing up and walking toward the bedroom. I'm not going to sit here and be accused of something I didn't do. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring into the fire. Her words replayed in my head. You know me. I'm not that kind of person. But did I really know her? Because right now, I wasn't so sure anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of Sarah tossing and turning next to me. The fire in the living room had long since burned out, but the fire inside my chest, anger, suspicion, doubt, just wouldn't go away. By morning, I was still restless. I got up early, made coffee, and sat on the cabin's deck overlooking the misty woods. The air was cold and crisp, but it didn't clear my mind. I was running through every possibility. Was the text innocent? Did I misinterpret it? Or worse, was she really hiding something from me? I didn't hear Sarah until she slid the door open behind me. Hey, she said softly, wrapping herself in a blanket and sitting across from me. You're up early. I didn't say anything at first, just sipped my coffee. Finally, I looked at her. We need to talk about last night. She let out a small sigh, like she'd been bracing herself. Jake, are we really doing this again? Yes, I said firmly. Because I need the truth, Sarah. I saw the message. Last night was amazing. You said it was a wrong number, but that doesn't sound like something random. She tucked her knees up under her chin, her face a mix of exhaustion and irritation. Okay, she said finally. It wasn't a wrong number. It was. Stacy. I blinked. Stacy? She nodded, running a hand through her hair. Yeah. We were out for her birthday, remember? She got really drunk, and I had to practically carry her home. She texted me later to say thanks. Last night was amazing, as in the party. It was her. My eyebrows furrowed. Why didn't you just say that last night? Because you were accusing me of cheating, she said, her voice rising slightly. Out of nowhere. I was upset, Jake. I didn't know how to respond because I couldn't believe you'd think that of me. I stayed quiet, trying to process her explanation. Look, she continued, her tone softening. You know how Stacy is. She's over the top about everything, and she says weird stuff when she's drunk. I didn't think it was a big deal, and I definitely didn't think you'd see the message and assume the worst. Her reasoning sounded plausible. I'd met Stacy plenty of times. She was one of Sarah's closest friends, and yeah, she had a habit of being dramatic, especially after a few drinks. I could almost hear her saying something like that without realizing how it might come across. Still, something gnawed at me. Then why didn't you just tell me it was Stacy from the start? I asked. Because you didn't even give me a chance, Sarah said, her voice tinged with frustration. You came at me like I'd already done something wrong. I panicked, okay? I shouldn't have brushed it off like I did, but it felt like you didn't trust me at all. I let out a slow breath, the tension in my shoulders loosening slightly. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was letting my insecurities ruin what should have been a perfect trip. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. Jake, you're the only one I want. I need you to trust me. If we don't have trust, we don't have anything, right? I looked at her, her soft eyes, her reassuring smile, and for a moment the doubts slipped away. You're right, I muttered, squeezing her hand. I'm sorry. Her face lit up, and she leaned over to kiss me softly. It's okay. Let's just enjoy this trip, okay? No more overthinking. I smiled back, forcing myself to push the message to the back of my mind. That day, we hiked through the woods, took photos, and cooked dinner together in the cabin. Sarah seemed like her usual self, playful, affectionate, and attentive, and I started to feel foolish for ever doubting her. Maybe I really was overthinking things. But that night, as I lay in bed next to her, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that something still didn't add up. If the message was really from Stacy, I thought, why didn't she just show me the text to prove it? The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the faint sound of Sarah humming softly in the kitchen. I blinked, the early sunlight pouring into the cabin through the curtains, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. Her explanation about Stacy had settled the tension, and though a small part of me still questioned it, I chose to let it go. I had to. Sarah wasn't just my girlfriend, she was the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. If I was going to propose, I couldn't carry around doubts. When I walked into the kitchen, Sarah turned to me with that easy, familiar smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. "Morning, sleepyhead." "Morning," I said, returning her smile. She handed me a mug of coffee and leaned up to kiss me on the cheek. "So, what's on the agenda today, Mr. Trip Planner?" "Relaxing mostly," I replied, taking a sip. "I thought we could head out to the lake later, maybe take some photos." "You game?" She grinned. "Only if you promise not to take 1,000 pictures of me like last time." "No promises," I teased, and for the first time in a while, I felt like things were back to normal. The day passed in a blur of laughter and moments that reminded me why I wanted to propose to her in the first place. We took a long walk around the lake, the sunlight filtering through the trees and reflecting off the water. Sarah joked about how bad I was at skipping stones while I laughed at her terrible attempts to beat me. At one point, I pulled out my camera to take a candid shot of her standing on a small dock, staring out at the water. She turned to me with a mock-serious expression. "You're obsessed," she said, placing her hands on her hips. "Guilty," I replied, grinning behind the lens. "Can't help it when my subject's this good-looking." She rolled her eyes, but I caught the blush on her face. "Cheesy as ever, Jake. Wouldn't have it any other way." That evening, we cooked dinner together, pasta with wine, then sat on the cabin porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. It was the kind of night that made everything else fade away. As we clinked glasses, Sarah looked at me thoughtfully. "You've been quieter lately. Is everything okay now?" "Yeah," I said honestly, looking into her eyes. "I just needed to get out of my own head. I'm sorry if I was being weird before." She smiled softly. "It's okay. I get it. You work so hard, and you care so much, sometimes you overthink things." "Yeah," I admitted, chuckling. "I'm lucky you put up with me." "You are," she teased, nudging me playfully. We sat there in comfortable silence, the wine warming me from the inside as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. For the first time in days, I felt completely at ease. That night, as we curled up together in bed, I ran through the proposal in my mind. The doubts I'd carried before seemed so far away now. Sarah loved me, she'd made that clear, and I loved her. Tomorrow, I thought, I'm going to ask her to marry me. I fell asleep with the kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long, long time. The next morning started just as perfectly as the day before. Sarah was cheerful, humming some song as she made breakfast. The smell of pancakes and coffee filled the cabin, and for a moment, everything felt right. I smiled to myself as I sat at the table, sipping coffee and watching her flip pancakes with practiced ease. It felt good, this quiet, simple life we shared. I was going to propose today. At least, that was the plan. After breakfast, we packed a picnic and headed back to the lake. Sarah was her usual playful self, tossing pebbles into the water, splashing me when I got too close, and joking about how she was winning some imaginary game she'd invented on the spot. I brought the ring box in my bag, tucked safely beneath a blanket, and every time she laughed or flashed me one of her radiant smiles, I thought, this is the moment. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked as we sat down to eat. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just soaking it all in." She grinned and leaned over to kiss me on the cheek. "You're such a sap, Jake." That evening, back at the cabin, she said she wanted to take a bath to relax. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked, giving me one of her sweet smiles. "Of course not," I said. Go enjoy yourself. As soon as I heard the water running, I settled onto the couch with my phone, planning to scroll through emails and unwind. But then, her phone buzzed. It was sitting on the coffee table, screen lit up with another message. I glanced over without thinking, expecting something harmless, maybe from Stacy again. But this time, it wasn't. Hey babe, missing you today. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. The message hit me like a fist to the chest. My stomach dropped, and my hands started to tremble. Hey babe. Not. Hey Sarah. Not some drunk friend. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was him. I stared at the message, my mind racing. It felt like the walls of the cabin were closing in on me. The easy, perfect day we just spent together felt like a lie. Every smile, every laugh, every moment she looked at me and said she loved me. Suddenly it all felt fake. My first instinct was to march into the bathroom, pound on the door, and demand the truth right then and there. But I couldn't. My heart was pounding too hard, and my thoughts were too jumbled. Instead, I set her phone back on the table like it burned my hand and sank into the couch. Sarah walked back into the room half an hour later, her hair damp, wearing one of her oversized sweaters and smiling contentedly. Your turn, she said brightly, sitting down next to me. I forced a nod, but I couldn't look at her. She frowned slightly. You okay? You look tired. I'm fine, I lied, my voice hoarse. Just a headache. Her face softened. Babe, I'm sorry. Want me to get you something? No, I said quickly. I'll just sit here for a bit. Okay, she said, leaning her head against my shoulder. We'll take it easy tonight. I sat there, stiff and silent, while she scrolled through her phone next to me. I didn't dare glance over, terrified of what else I might see. The ring was still in my bag, tucked safely away where she couldn't find it. I had been ready to propose today, to ask her to spend the rest of her life with me, but now the words felt like ash in my mouth. How could I ask her to marry me when I didn't even know who she really was? That night, as she drifted off to sleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The message replayed in my head, over and over. Hey babe, missing you today. Last night was incredible. I had ignored the first red flag, let her convince me I was overthinking. But now, I couldn't ignore it. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself, or the fact that I still didn't have the courage to confront her. Not yet. The day after I saw the message, I felt like a ghost in my own life. Sarah was as cheerful as ever, acting like nothing had changed, like she hadn't blown everything apart with the buzz of a single text message. I watched her move around the cabin, pretending to focus on the little things, but my mind was miles away. Every smile she gave me, every laugh, every affectionate touch, it all felt like a knife twisting deeper into my back. Was this all fake? I kept asking myself. But I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. That afternoon, Sarah suggested we take a walk around the lake again. I didn't have the energy to argue, so I went along, letting her ramble about future plans and upcoming events while my thoughts swirled into chaos. Wouldn't it be nice to get a place like this someday? She said, kicking a pebble along the trail. Something small and cozy, just for us. Yeah, I muttered, forcing the words out. You're so quiet today, she said, linking her arm through mine. Are you sure you're feeling okay? Just tired, I replied. Poor thing, she cooed, pressing a kiss to my shoulder. We'll have a cozy night in, okay? Just us. The words made me sick to my stomach. That evening, I sat outside on the porch while Sarah showered. The sun had started to set, casting an orange glow over the lake, but I couldn't enjoy it. All I could think about was the text. Who was he? I hadn't recognized the number, and Sarah hadn't slipped up enough for me to figure it out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it wasn't some stranger. As I sat there, the realization hit me like a freight train. What if it was someone close to us? My chest tightened as I ran through the possibilities. Friends. Co-workers. And then, The neighbor. The neighbor. Chris lived next door to us. He was a guy in his early 30s, recently divorced, and always overly friendly whenever we ran into him. I hadn't thought much of it before. He was just Chris, the neighbor with the nice car and the annoying habit of mowing his lawn at 7 a.m. But the more I thought about it, the more I started connecting dots I didn't even know existed. I remembered Sarah talking to him outside our place a couple of weeks back. They'd been laughing at something, her hand brushing his arm in that casual, familiar way that had seemed harmless at the time. I'd ignored it then. But now it felt like a red flag I'd missed entirely. When Sarah came out of the bathroom later that night, she found me sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. "Jake? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I looked up at her, studying her face, so innocent, so practiced. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." "Still?" She sat beside me, rubbing my back gently. "Maybe you're coming down with something." I was coming down with the truth, I thought bitterly. That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I got up and went into the living room. I grabbed her phone off the coffee table again, my hands shaking as I unlocked it with the code I'd seen her use 1,000 times. I scrolled through her messages, my pulse pounding in my ears. Most of it was harmless, conversations with friends, work reminders, but then I found it. The messages with Chris. The thread wasn't long, she'd clearly been deleting parts of it, but there was enough there to make my blood run cold. "Chris, can you sneak away again soon? Last night was unreal." "Sarah, not yet. I don't want him to get suspicious." "Chris, you're worth the risk, babe." I put the phone down and stared at it, my hands trembling. It wasn't some stranger. It wasn't some accident. It was Chris, the guy I waved to every morning, the guy who borrowed my tools, the guy who smiled at me like he hadn't been sneaking around with my girlfriend behind my back. And it happened the night before we left for the trip. The night I'd been finalizing every detail of the proposal, Sarah had been with him. I sat there in the dark, the ring still in my bag, feeling like the biggest fool on the planet. How did I not see this? I thought about confronting her right then, waking her up and shoving the truth in her face. But I couldn't. Not yet. I didn't even know what I'd say. Instead, I sat in the silence of that cabin, staring at the floor, knowing that everything I'd planned, everything I dreamed of, was gone. The proposal I'd been so sure about would never happen. Sarah wasn't the person I thought she was. And now, I had to decide what to do next. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat there, staring at the walls of the cabin while Sarah slept peacefully in the next room. Like everything was fine, like nothing had happened. The texts between her and Chris replayed in my mind on an endless loop. "Can you sneak away again soon? Last night was unreal." Her words. "I don't want him to get suspicious." I wanted to scream, to break something, to wake her up and demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I sat in silence, suffocating under the weight of what I'd just learned. By morning I had convinced myself to play it cool. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not here. Not in this place that was supposed to be a memory for the best day of our lives. Sarah, of course, was as bright and cheerful as ever. She came into the living room wearing one of my hoodies, her hair in a messy bun, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Morning," she chirped, stretching her arms. "I slept like a baby. You feeling any better?" "Yeah," I said flatly. "A little." She sat on the arm of the couch and looked at me with that same easy smile she always had. "Good. Because today's going to be fun. I thought we could go into town, check out some shops, maybe grab dinner later. What do you think?" I forced a smile, though I'm sure it didn't reach my eyes. "Sounds great." The drive into town was a blur. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone like nothing was wrong. Every laugh, every little comment she made grated on me. I thought back to all the moments I'd ignored, her staying out late, the messages she brushed off, the way she'd been acting so normal while stabbing me in the back. Had this been going on for weeks? Months? When we arrived in town, Sarah grabbed my hand, leading me through little antique shops and local markets. I played along, nodding when she pointed things out, pretending like I wasn't dying inside. At one point, she picked up a set of matching mugs with little hearts on them. "These are so cute," she said. "We should get them for the house." The house. The one I'd been imagining we'd share as husband and wife. I clenched my jaw and shook my head. "Let's keep looking." We spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through town, Sarah completely oblivious to the fact that I wasn't really there with her. My mind was somewhere else, replaying every moment we'd shared over the past few months and re-examining it for lies. The way she smiled at Chris when she talked to him outside our house. The sudden late nights. The excuses? It was all so obvious now. I had just been too blind to see it. That evening, back at the cabin, Sarah made dinner while I sat at the table, watching her in silence. She moved around the kitchen humming to herself, stopping every now and then to smile at me. "You're so quiet today," she said, looking over her shoulder. "Are you still not feeling great?" "I'm fine," I muttered, forcing a small smile. "Good." She set down 2 plates and sat across from me. "Because tomorrow's our last full day here, and I want it to be perfect." Perfect. It was almost laughable. Later that night, while Sarah showered, I sat on the edge of the bed with the ring box in my hand. I opened it, staring at the diamond that I had spent months saving up for. It was beautiful. I had picked it because it reminded me of her, bright, elegant, and full of promise. But now it felt meaningless. I closed the box and slipped it back into my bag. When Sarah came out of the bathroom, she found me staring out the cabin window, lost in thought. "Jake?" she said softly, walking up behind me. "You okay?" I turned around, forcing myself to look at her. "Yeah," I lied. "I'm fine." She smiled and slipped her arms around my waist, resting her head against my chest. "I love you, you know," she murmured. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at her words. "I know," I said quietly, though I didn't believe it anymore. That night, as she fell asleep beside me, I lay awake again, my mind spinning. I knew I couldn't keep quiet forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning felt like the calm before a storm. The air in the cabin was still, heavy with the unspoken truth hanging between Sarah and me, well, unspoken on my end. To her, it was just another perfect day. "Want me to make pancakes again?" she called from the kitchen, her voice chipper and bright. I stared at her as she moved around, acting as if we were 2 people in love, on the verge of building our future together. The betrayal was all I could see now, clouding every glance, every word, every touch. "No," I said finally, my voice flat. "I'm good." "Suit yourself," she replied unfazed, as she flipped a pancake in the skillet. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind felt like it was eating itself alive, running circles around the text from Chris. Her cheerful tone made it worse, like she was mocking me without even knowing it. I got up from the table and walked outside to the porch, letting the cold air bite my face. I stared out at the mist over the lake, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. A couple of hours later, Sarah suggested we go on one last hike before leaving the cabin the next day. "We need to take advantage of the view," she said, smiling. "It's beautiful out there." I agreed, but not because I wanted to hike. I needed time to figure out what I was going to say. How do you even confront someone who's been lying to you while they act like they're madly in love? We spent the next hour walking a quiet trail through the woods. Sarah was ahead of me, talking about random things, plans for the next weekend, ideas for dinner back home, while I trailed behind, barely hearing her. Finally, she turned around, smiling. "Jake, are you even listening?" I stopped in my tracks. "No," I said sharply, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. Her smile faltered, confusion crossing her face. "What's wrong with you? You've been acting so weird this whole trip. You really want to know what's wrong, Sarah?" I said, my hands clenching at my sides. "Fine. Let's talk about Chris. Her face paled instantly. For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't know what to say. What? She finally whispered. You heard me. I snapped. I know about you and Chris. I saw the texts. You didn't want me to get suspicious? You were sneaking off the night before this trip to be with him. Don't lie to me again, Sarah. Her face went from pale to flushed in seconds. What texts are you even talking about? You went through my phone? Don't turn this around on me. I shot back. I saw it. Last night was unreal? You're worth the risk? Those are his words, Sarah, not mine. I don't need you to pretend anymore. Her expression crumbled as she took a step back. Jake, I can explain. Explain? I interrupted, laughing bitterly. Explain what? That while I was planning to propose to you, you were sneaking around with our neighbor? That you were throwing everything we had away for him? Go ahead, Sarah. I'd love to hear the explanation for that. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might come clean. But then she straightened up, her face twisting with something between anger and desperation. It wasn't like that, she said, her voice shaky. It wasn't serious. I made a mistake, Jake. I was upset, and Chris was there, and... Stop, I said, cutting her off. I don't want to hear it. You can lie to yourself, but don't lie to me. You knew exactly what you were doing. She shook her head frantically. It didn't mean anything. It was stupid, and I regret it, Jake. Please, you have to believe me. Believe you? I said, my voice cracking. Sarah, I was going to propose to you. Tomorrow. I had the ring in my bag, and I was ready to ask you to spend the rest of your life with me. Do you understand that? Her face fell, the tears spilling over now. Jake, I didn't know. I didn't think. No, you didn't think, I said coldly. And now you don't have to. The hike back to the cabin was silent. Sarah tried to talk a few times, but I ignored her. What else was there to say? Back at the cabin, I grabbed my bag and started packing. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed quietly. Please, Jake, she whispered. Please don't leave like this. We can work through it. I zipped up my bag and turned to look at her. There's no we anymore, Sarah. Not after this. She didn't argue. She didn't have the energy to. I walked out of the cabin without looking back, leaving behind the life I thought we were building. As I drove away, the ring sat in the passenger seat beside me, the box still unopened. I glanced at it for a moment before pulling over on the side of the road. With a deep breath, I picked it up, stepped out of the car, and hurled it as far as I could into the trees. It wasn't the proposal I'd planned, but it was the closure I needed. The drive home from the cabin felt longer than it should have. Hours stretched into an eternity as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind replaying everything: Sarah's tearful face, her excuses, the messages I couldn't unsee. I kept expecting the anger to bubble up, but all I felt was empty. Hollow. I had gone into that weekend ready to ask the woman I loved to marry me. And now? I was driving home alone, trying to make sense of how quickly everything had fallen apart. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Chris's house next door. It was dark, silent, like no one was home. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at his front door, my fists clenching at the thought of him. The neighbor I'd waved to. Helped shovel snow with. Let borrow my tools. All the while, he'd been with my girlfriend. A wave of nausea hit me, and I forced myself to look away. There wasn't any point confronting him. Nothing he could say would change what had happened. Instead, I grabbed my bag, walked into my empty house, and shut the door behind me. The silence inside was deafening. Everything was exactly how we'd left it, Sarah's sweater thrown over the back of a chair, her mug still sitting in the sink. It felt like she could walk through the door at any moment, flashing me that easy smile, as though nothing had happened. But she wouldn't. And I didn't want her to. I tossed my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the couch, running my hands over my face. The reality of it all came crashing down. The plans I'd made. The dreams we'd talked about. The life I thought we were building together. Gone. I stared at the empty space across the room, where I'd imagined us sitting together, celebrating our engagement. I could see it so clearly, Sarah laughing, showing off the ring, saying, "Yes." Now it felt like someone else's life, like a scene from a movie I didn't want to watch anymore. Over the next few days, I avoided everything and everyone. I ignored texts from friends, silenced my phone, and spent most of my time holed up in the house. Chris had tried reaching out once. He sent a short, gutless text. "Hey man, can we talk?" I didn't reply. I didn't need to hear his pathetic excuses. Sarah, on the other hand, called me more times than I could count. She left voicemails filled with apologies, pleading with me to let her explain, to fix things. But every time her name popped up on my screen, I felt that same hollow ache. I couldn't listen to her voice without hearing the lies in it. One evening, Chris's car pulled into his driveway, and I watched through the window as he got out. I hadn't seen him since before the trip, and something inside me snapped at the sight of him. Before I even realized what I was doing, I was out the front door, marching across the lawn. "Chris!" I barked. He turned, his expression falling the moment he saw me. "Jake, listen. Don't." I cut him off, my voice cold. "Don't you dare try to explain yourself." He took a step back, raising his hands defensively. "It wasn't." "Wasn't what?" I snapped. "Wasn't what it looked like? I saw the messages, Chris. I know what happened. You don't get to stand here and pretend you're innocent." He looked down at the ground, shame written all over his face. "I messed up," he muttered. "I never wanted it to happen this way, Jake." I clenched my fists, my blood boiling. "You were my neighbor. I trusted you. I let you into my life, and you repay me by sneaking around with my girlfriend?" Chris looked up, guilt plastered all over his face, but he didn't argue. He didn't try to defend himself. I shook my head, my voice lowering. "You're a coward." Then I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in his driveway. Back inside, I slammed the door behind me, my chest heaving as I tried to calm down. For the first time since I'd caught Sarah, the anger felt real, raw and overwhelming. But once the anger faded, the emptiness came back. That night, I sat alone on the couch, a drink in my hand, staring at nothing. I thought about the person I'd been just a few days ago, the guy with a ring in his pocket, ready to start his future. I didn't know who I was now. But I knew one thing for sure: I was done with Sarah. And I was done letting her or Chris take up space in my life. The next morning, I woke up with the weight of everything still sitting heavy on my chest. The confrontation with Chris hadn't given me the relief I thought it would. Yelling at him, seeing the guilt in his face, it didn't change what had happened. But it was a start. Over the next few days, Sarah kept calling, but I stopped checking her voicemails. I didn't want to hear her excuses or her tears anymore. I was done listening to lies. On the 5th day after I'd walked out of the cabin, she sent a text. "Jake, please let me explain. You can hate me, but you deserve to hear the truth." I stared at the message for a long time before turning off my phone. Maybe I deserved the truth, but I wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. Chris, on the other hand, avoided me completely. If he wasn't home, his car wasn't in the driveway. If he was home, his lights stayed off. I imagined him peeking through the blinds every time he heard my door open, afraid I'd show up again. It didn't matter. I had no plans to deal with him anymore. He'd already taken enough from me. A week passed, then another. Slowly, the anger began to settle, leaving me alone with the quiet, creeping sadness I hadn't been ready to face. It hit me one evening as I was cleaning out the spare room, what had once been our spare room. There, at the bottom of a storage box, was a small envelope labeled "Anniversary Ideas," in Sarah's handwriting. Inside were little notes she'd written about future trips she wanted to take, restaurants she wanted us to try, and random ideas for surprises she thought I'd like. I sat there on the floor, staring at the notes, my throat tightening. We'd planned a future together. Hell, I'd almost put a ring on her finger. And now, all I had were scraps of paper that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The next day, Chris's house went up for sale. A big, bright, "for sale" sign popped up in his yard, and a realtor started showing the place to strangers. It was a small, petty thing, but seeing that sign made me feel like I'd won. Chris was running. Maybe he was ashamed, or maybe it was just too uncomfortable living next to me. Either way, he was gone, and good riddance. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, I started to put my life back together. I focused on work, staying late at the office just to keep my mind busy. I started going to the gym again, something I'd neglected for months. The physical exhaustion helped drown out the mental noise. Chris moved out of the neighborhood without a word, and Sarah finally gave up on trying to contact me. I'd blocked her number after her last text. I didn't need closure from her. I was learning to give it to myself. One Saturday, Chris's house officially sold, and the new neighbors started moving in. I watched from my window as a family unloaded boxes. 2 parents, a couple of kids, and a dog that looked like it had way too much energy. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. It felt like a clean slate, not just for Chris's house, but for me, too. That evening, I decided to clean out the last of Sarah's things. Her clothes, her toiletries, the little trinkets she'd left behind. I stuffed everything into boxes, sealing them up with tape. At the bottom of her dresser drawer, I found a photo of us. It was from our first year together, a trip we'd taken to the mountains, back when everything still felt perfect. I stared at the picture for a moment before sliding it into one of the boxes. It didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. When I dropped her things off at her friend Stacy's house later that night, I left the boxes on the porch, rang the bell, and walked back to my car without waiting for anyone to answer. I didn't need to see her. I didn't need an explanation. This was me letting go. That night, I sat on the couch with a beer in my hand, staring out the window at the darkened neighborhood. It was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't okay yet, but I would be. It's funny how life starts to move forward, even when you're not sure you're ready for it. Days turned into weeks, and then weeks into months. Slowly but surely, I started finding pieces of myself again, the parts one thought Sarah had taken when she betrayed me. At first, it was the small things. I reorganized the house, replacing the lingering traces of her presence. The sweater she'd left draped over the chair? Gone. The silly notes on the fridge? Tossed. I bought new bedding and even painted the living room a deep navy, something I'd always wanted but Sarah had vetoed. It felt like reclaiming my space. My life. Chris's house was now fully occupied by the new family. I'd see the kids running around the yard, their parents shouting playfully as the dog chased after them. It was like watching life replace the decay next door, and it gave me a sense of relief. One afternoon, as I was mowing my lawn, the new neighbor, Greg, walked over with a smile and 2 beers in hand. "Hey, I'm Greg. Figured I'd come introduce myself." I took the beer, shaking his hand. "Jake. Good to meet you." We stood there chatting for a while, normal stuff. Jobs, hobbies, how much of a pain moving in had been. There was no awkwardness, no hidden guilt hanging in the air. Just 2 guys talking. As he walked back toward his house, I realized it was the first time in a long time that I'd had a normal conversation with someone on this street. Work became my next focus. I'd always been good at my job, but I threw myself into it with new energy, taking on extra projects, pushing for bigger responsibilities. My boss noticed. "Jake, I don't know what lit a fire under you lately, but keep it up," he said after I delivered a major presentation. I shrugged, a small smile pulling at my lips. Just trying to stay focused. Work was one place where I didn't have to think about Sarah, or Chris, or the future that never was. I could put my head down, get things done, and feel a sense of control over something. And for a while, that was enough. It was Chris's ex-wife, Melissa, who unexpectedly reappeared in my life a few weeks later. I ran into her at a coffee shop near my office. She was sitting by the window, typing something into her laptop, when she looked up and saw me. "Jake?" she said, standing and giving me a small wave. I hesitated for a second before walking over. "Melissa." "Hey." She smiled, a little awkwardly, and gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Sit down. It's been a while." I slid into the chair, my coffee still warm in my hand. Melissa and I had only ever talked in passing back when she and Chris were together, but now? It felt different. Like we were both survivors of the same disaster. "I heard you and Sarah split," she said after a moment, her tone cautious. "Yeah," I replied simply. She studied me for a second before sighing. "Let me guess, Chris had something to do with it." I blinked, caught off guard. "You knew?" Melissa scoffed, shaking her head. "Of course I knew. That's why we divorced. Chris never could keep his promises, or his hands to himself." Hearing it out loud hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd been wrestling with the question of why. Why Sarah? Why Chris? Why me? But sitting across from Melissa, I realized it had nothing to do with me at all. Chris was just Chris. "You're better off," Melissa said, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Trust me." I nodded, letting her words sink in. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think I am." That conversation stuck with me. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of Sarah's betrayal like it was my burden to bear, as if I'd done something to deserve it. But the truth was, her actions said more about her than they did about me. And Chris? He was just a guy who made a habit of ruining the people closest to him. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The following weekend, I went on my first real hike since the cabin trip. It wasn't a big deal, just a solo day trip to a trail about an hour outside the city, but it felt significant. The last time I'd been on a trail like this, I'd been carrying a ring in my bag and a pit in my stomach. Now, I was carrying nothing but my camera and a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. At the top of the trail, I stood looking out over the valley, the wind cool on my face. I pulled out my camera, snapping a photo of the view. It was beautiful, pure, untouched, and mine to enjoy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That night, I posted the photo online with a simple caption. "Sometimes losing everything clears the way for something better." It wasn't meant to be profound, but the likes and comments flooded in almost immediately. Friends I hadn't talked to in months reached out, sending words of encouragement and checking in on me. One comment stood out though. It was from Melissa. "Well said. Onward and upward, Jake." I smiled to myself, feeling like the final piece of a long, messy puzzle had clicked into place. When I went to bed that night, the house felt quieter than usual. But for the first time, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I didn't know what was coming next, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Whatever it was, I'd be ready. Over the next few months, life started to feel like it was truly mine again. The house was finally just a house, no longer filled with shadows of Sarah or reminders of Chris. I spent my weekends hiking, diving deeper into photography, and reconnecting with friends I'd unintentionally pushed away during the worst of it. It wasn't perfect. I still had bad days, moments where the past snuck up on me like a ghost I couldn't shake, but they were getting fewer and farther between. One afternoon, while cleaning out some old boxes, I found the receipt for the engagement ring. I froze, holding the paper between my fingers, feeling the sting of that memory. It had been months since I last thought about the ring, months since I'd thrown it into the trees near the cabin. Seeing that receipt reminded me of who I had been back then, hopeful, naive, and completely unaware of what was about to happen. But instead of bitterness, I felt something different now. Gratitude, maybe? Relief? It was strange, but I finally understood that the life I'd planned with Sarah wasn't the life I was meant to live. I put the receipt in the shredder without a second thought, the sound oddly satisfying. That evening, Chris's old house finally had its sold sign taken down. The new neighbors, Greg and his family, were fully settled in, and their kids were running around the front yard, shrieking with laughter. As I watched them through the window, Greg waved at me from his driveway. I waved back, feeling a flicker of something unexpected: hope. The house next door, once a symbol of betrayal, was now just another home. It no longer carried the weight of what Chris and Sarah had done. It was just a place. Later that night, I sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, Max, my golden retriever, curled up at my feet. I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. Sarah's lies. Chris's betrayal. The plans I had made and lost. And then I thought about everything I'd gained. A stronger version of myself. A life I was finally proud of. A clean slate. The next morning, as I grabbed my coffee and sat at my desk, I noticed an unread email notification on my laptop. It was from Sarah. My chest tightened for a moment, but I clicked it open, curiosity winning out. The email was short and to the point. "Jake, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for how I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you're doing well. You deserve to be happy." I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the laptop. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I just felt done. The chapter was closed. That weekend I drove out to the trail where I'd thrown the engagement ring months earlier. I didn't know why I went back. Maybe part of me wanted to see the spot again, to reclaim the memory. When I reached the clearing, I stood there for a while, breathing in the cool mountain air. The trees were just as quiet and still as I remembered. I couldn't see the ring, of course. It was long gone, probably buried under leaves or carried away by some curious animal. But I smiled anyway. The person who had thrown that ring, broken, angry, and lost, wasn't the person standing there now. I pulled out my camera and took a photo of the clearing. The sunlight broke through the branches, lighting up the space in a way that felt almost poetic. Sometimes you have to let go of the past to see the beauty in the present. When I got back to my car, I pulled out my phone and texted Greg. "Hey, want to grab a beer this week?" "My treat," he replied almost instantly. "Sounds good, neighbor. Let's do it." That night, I sat on the porch again, watching the stars blink to life in the dark sky. Max snored quietly at my feet, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel haunted. I didn't know what was coming next, but I wasn't afraid of it. The life I thought I'd lost was never really mine to begin with. And the one I was building now? It was going to be better than anything I'd planned. Months passed, and my life continued to move forward. The scars were still there, of course, quiet reminders of what I'd been through, but they no longer hurt. Instead, they felt like lessons I'd earned, proof of how far I'd come. One Saturday morning, I found myself back on the hiking trail where I'd thrown the engagement ring. It had become one of my favorite spots, a place where I could clear my head and enjoy the quiet. This time, though, I wasn't alone. "Are you always this fast, or are you trying to leave me behind?" Heather teased, jogging up beside me with her camera slung around her neck. I grinned. "You've got to keep up, rookie." We'd met at a photography workshop a few months earlier, and what started as a casual friendship quickly grew into something more. Heather was nothing like Sarah. She was genuine, grounded, and endlessly supportive. Being around her was easy, like breathing. She tilted her head, studying me for a second. "You're smiling. What are you thinking about?" I looked out over the trail, the sunlight filtering through the trees in soft, golden streaks. "Just how much can change in a year," I said. Later, as we sat on a rocky overlook eating sandwiches, Heather pulled out her camera and snapped a candid shot of me. "Hey," I protested, holding up a hand. "What was that for?" She smirked. "You looked happy. I wanted to capture it." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You're something else, you know that?" "Yeah, but you like me anyway," she said with a wink. She wasn't wrong. When we got back to the car, I paused, turning to look at the clearing one last time. The place where I'd thrown away the ring, where I thought my life had fallen apart, didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like freedom. Heather nudged my arm. You coming, or are you just going to stare into the woods all day? I smiled, walking toward her. Yeah. I'm coming. As I got into the car, I took one last look in the rearview mirror before driving away. Some chapters in life end painfully, but that doesn't mean the story is over. Sometimes the best parts come after you think you've reached the end. And this was just the beginning.